The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of voices, the sterile lights above casting a harsh white glow on everything below. In one corner of the room sat a man in a crisp, charcoal gray suit, tall, with broad shoulders, a square jaw, and an air of calm authority. He was General Charles Rivers, a decorated 4-star officer in the U.S. Army. His posture was upright, his eyes steady, and yet, despite his dignified presence, he sat alone at the defendant's table, accused of a minor traffic infraction that had somehow spiraled into something far more degrading. Across the aisle stood Officer Raymond Doyle, the arresting cop, stocky, red-faced, with a sneer that hadn't left his lips since he walked in. He leaned against the prosecution's desk with smug confidence, flipping through notes he barely needed to read. From the moment he'd pulled Rivers over weeks ago, Doyle hadn't hidden his contempt. To him, Rivers was just another black man behind the wheel of a nice car. He didn't see the medals, the years of service, the battles fought, or the countless soldiers whose lives Rivers had influenced. He only saw what he wanted to see. When Doyle took the stand to give his testimony, his words were laced with sarcasm, thinly veiled hostility, and exaggerated details. He recounted how Rivers had been combative, how he'd refused to cooperate, how he'd seemed arrogant and entitled. Doyle even chuckled mid-testimony, shaking his head as though recalling a hilarious moment from a sitcom, not a routine traffic stop that had resulted in handcuffs and humiliation. Rivers remained quiet, his expression unreadable. He let Doyle talk, let him laugh, let the courtroom indulge the image of a defiant man who thought himself above the law. But beneath the surface, the general's mind was sharp, focused, not on revenge, but on the truth, which he knew would reveal itself in due time. His attorney, a young and eager public defender named Jamie Holloway, looked uneasy. She'd been assigned to the case last minute and, while competent, she clearly felt out of her depth. Rivers didn't blame her, the weight of the room was suffocating. The judge, an older man with a bored expression, hadn't even looked Rivers in the eye once. To most people in that courtroom, he was just a name on a docket, a number in the system, another black man with an attitude. But they didn't know who he really was. After Doyle's testimony ended, Jamie stood, cleared her throat, and began her cross-examination. She was tentative at first, questioning the timeline, asking for clarification on minor discrepancies. Doyle answered with a smirk, his tone dripping with disdain. When she brought up Rivers' military background, Doyle dismissed it with a shrug. "Yeah, I heard he was some kind of officer," he said, mocking the title. "Didn't act like it." That was the moment Rivers' eyes flickered with the faintest spark. Jamie looked at her client and then at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, gaining confidence, "before we continue, the defense would like to request a brief recess. General Rivers would like to make a phone call." The judge raised an eyebrow. "This isn't a social hour, counselor." "It's relevant to the case," Jamie pressed. "And it could significantly impact the direction of the proceedings." With an exasperated sigh, the judge agreed. 5 minutes. Rivers stood, nodded once in appreciation, and stepped out into the hallway. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number. He paused only briefly before pressing dial. The call was answered on the second ring. General Rivers, a deep voice answered, immediately respectful. "Major General Adams," Rivers replied calmly. "I need a favor." Back inside the courtroom, Doyle leaned back. In his chair, still grinning. Probably calling his lawyer to make a deal, he muttered loud enough for a few people nearby to hear. A couple of them chuckled. The bailiff looked uncomfortable but said nothing. When Rivers returned, he didn't speak to anyone. He walked to the table, sat down, and waited. Exactly 2 minutes later, the double doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a bang. Every head turned. In walked 2 men in full-dress military uniform, one a lieutenant colonel, the other a general. Behind them, a U.S. Marshal followed silently, carrying a folder under one arm. The entire room changed. Whispers erupted. The judge sat up straighter. Doyle paled. The general who entered approached the bench and respectfully addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we are here on behalf of the Department of Defense to provide character testimony for General Charles Rivers. We have documentation attesting to his service record, security clearance, chain of command, and a personal letter from the Secretary of Defense. Furthermore, we have video footage from the arrest, recorded from a military vehicle's onboard camera that had coincidentally been trailing the general's car that day. Doyle froze. The folder was handed to the judge. As he flipped through it, his expression changed from indifferent to unsettled. Jamie looked stunned. Doyle's smirk had vanished completely. "I believe," the general continued, "that once this video is reviewed, the court will find the officer's testimony to be inconsistent with the events as they actually occurred." The judge looked at the bailiff. "Play the video." The screen flickered to life. There was the road, the SUV, the flashing lights of Doyle's patrol car. Then the stop. Doyle approaching with his hand on his holster before Rivers even rolled down the window. The audio made everything clear. Rivers was calm, cooperative. Doyle was aggressive, accusatory, and within 3 minutes, unnecessarily violent. When the video ended, the room was silent. The judge took a long breath and looked at Doyle. "Officer, you failed to mention this level of force. Or the general's compliance, or your threatening language," Doyle stammered, looking between the judge and the now expressionless Rivers. I didn't know he was being recorded." "That much is clear," the judge snapped. Jamie stood. "Defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges." "Granted," the judge said without hesitation. He looked at Rivers. "General, you are free to go. On behalf of this court, I apologize." Rivers stood slowly. He gave a single nod to the judge, then turned to Doyle, who now looked like he might melt into the floor. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. That one phone call had turned the tables, not out of arrogance, but because truth carries weight when backed by dignity, service, and integrity. And in that courtroom, the laughter had stopped. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. General Rivers stood quietly near the steps, his hands clasped behind his back as reporters began to gather like moths to flame. Cameras flashed, voices called out, but he ignored them all. He wasn't there for spectacle. The courtroom may have cleared his name, but the damage done by that traffic stop, by the humiliation, the false narrative, the assumption of guilt, could not be erased with a single ruling. He waited, patient and still, until Jamie Holloway emerged, clutching her files tightly. She looked at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. "General," she said, I've never seen anything like that. They came in like something out of a movie." Rivers offered her a faint smile. "Sometimes people need to be reminded that truth isn't about volume, it's about precision. You did well today." Jamie flushed with pride but also a touch of shame. "I wish I'd done more. I should have pushed harder from the beginning." "You did enough," he said, his voice kind but firm. "And now it's time to do more." She tilted her head. "More." But Rivers was already walking, not toward his car, but back inside the building, into the administrative office where complaints were filed. Jamie followed, uncertain but intrigued. The receptionist looked up as they entered, startled by the man's presence and the subtle authority he carried with him. "I need to file a formal complaint," Rivers said calmly. "Internal Affairs. Regarding Officer Raymond Doyle." The receptionist quickly handed him the necessary forms. Rivers took a seat and began writing. Not with anger, not with haste, but with the meticulous hand of a man who had written countless after-action reports. He detailed the encounter, the lies told in court, the abuse of power, and the immediate judgment passed based solely on skin color. By the time he signed his name, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. This was no longer just about a dismissed charge. It was about accountability. By the following morning, the video footage had gone viral. Someone in the courtroom had leaked it, perhaps one of the junior aides or maybe a reporter with access. Either way, it was now everywhere. On the news, across social media, replayed frame by frame on cable talk shows. The narrative that had once painted Rivers as another, difficult suspect, was completely shattered. Now the world saw what really happened, how a decorated military leader had been treated like a criminal for nothing more than driving while black. Public outcry followed quickly. Civil rights groups issued statements. Veterans organizations rallied behind Rivers. Even the Pentagon released a subtle but unmistakable memo emphasizing the importance of respecting service members, regardless of rank or race, in civilian life. Pressure mounted on the local police department, and within days, Officer Doyle was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. But Rivers remained silent through it all. Not once did he speak to the press. Not once did he post online. He let the facts speak for themselves. What few people knew was that Rivers had already started taking meetings behind the scenes, with community leaders, with legal experts, with officers in the military justice system who had seen these patterns before. He wasn't interested in destroying Doyle, he was interested in changing the system that created him. 1 week after the trial, Rivers was invited to speak at a town hall meeting organized by the city council. The room was packed, standing room only. Everyone from teenagers with protest signs to retired veterans sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting to hear from the man who had become an unwilling symbol of something much larger than a traffic stop. When he finally took the stage, he didn't speak like a man seeking revenge. He spoke like a soldier who had seen too much war, just not always the kind fought overseas. "I didn't come here to shame anyone," he began, his deep voice resonating across the room. "I came here because this, what happened to me, is not just my story. It is the story of millions. And the reason I didn't fight back at that traffic stop is because I knew I was not the first. I knew that whatever I said would be twisted. I knew that the truth needed to be shown, not shouted." He paused. The room was silent. "I've served this country for over 3 decades. I've led troops into combat. I've briefed presidents. But none of that mattered when a badge saw my skin color before my credentials. That's not just bad policing. That's a betrayal of what this country claims to stand for." There were nods. There were tears. "I'm not interested in punishing one man," Rivers continued. "I'm interested in reforming a culture." Officer Doyle didn't act alone. He acted with the silent permission of a system that has done too little to check its own biases. That's where change must begin. He concluded with a call to action, not just for law enforcement, but for citizens, educators, and leaders across sectors. He urged the creation of bias training programs that weren't just check-the-box exercises. He proposed a partnership between the military and police departments, where veterans could share insights on leadership, ethics, and restraint. And he pushed for independent oversight in every municipality, so no officer could hide behind the blue wall of silence again. Afterward, dozens approached him, some to thank him, others simply to shake his hand. Among them was a young black boy, no more than 12, who looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "My dad said you're a real hero," the boy whispered. Rivers knelt down so they were eye to eye. "A real hero is someone who stands up even when no one's watching," he said. "Think you can do that?" The boy nodded fiercely. As the days passed, reforms began slowly. Officer Doyle's case became a turning point in the city's handling of misconduct. He was eventually dismissed from the force, not just because of what he did, but because the city could no longer afford to defend the indefensible. More importantly, a broader investigation was launched into patterns of racial profiling within the department. General Rivers returned to his base soon after, resuming his duties quietly. He never once claimed victimhood. He never accepted speaking fees. He simply kept working, writing policies, mentoring officers, and laying the groundwork for a future where dignity wasn't dependent on uniform, rank, or complexion. That one phone call had revealed a truth many refused to see. And that silence in the courtroom, the moment when a racist laugh had been replaced by utter stillness, was still echoing across the country.